to a Hope 1032 podcast.
I'm Colette Smart, and I'm a psychologist, a teacher, and your host on Raising Teens. I'm also a parent, and I'm in the middle of raising my own teens and young adult children. I know that raising teens can be fun and busy, but also terrifying and even lonely. I've experienced all of these emotions, sometimes in the same day. On this podcast, I'm joined by well-known experts, and we chat about some of the most common questions I get asked about raising teenagers in my own work, and even some questions I have myself. I have such hope for this generation of young people, so each episode is full of support and practical advice. I love seeing all your questions come in, so each season I focus on some that teachers, parents, and carers have raised. We're all caring for the teens we love so much, so please keep sending in your ideas and questions through my Instagram and Facebook page or via the Hope 1032 podcast webpage, so we can support this generation of teens together. Dr. Michael Carr Gregg is one of Australia's highest profile psychologists working in all forms of media. He's a successful author, speaker, broadcaster, and mental health advocate. Michael works in private practice in Melbourne, and he's been the recipient of a number of awards, including being named Paul Harris Fellow by Rotary International in recognition of his work in the prevention of youth suicide in 1997 and again in 2021. Michael has a very impressive history as a psychologist, so some highlights include that he is one of the founding members of the National Coalition Against Bullying. He's part of the change in Australia on boys' education and middle school reform. In 2004, Michael published the first parenting book on cyber safety in Australia called The Real Wired Child. In 2016, Michael was appointed the Managing Director of the Young and Well CRC, which is an Australian-based international research centre that united young people with researchers, practitioners and innovators from over 70 partner organisations, including Vic Health, to explore the role of technology in young people's lives and how these technologies can be used to improve their well-being. While there, he wrote and launched the world's first ever certificate in young people's mental health and technology. In 2019, the New South Wales Education Minister, Rob Stokes, asked Michael to head a review into the non-educational use of smartphones in schools. It was the first of its kind in Australia. The resulting report recommendations were taken up by Victoria, Tasmania, and Western Australia. Hello, Michael. Welcome to Raising Teens.
Thank you for having me.
So, Michael, it was about 20 years ago, I think, when I arrived in Australia. You were one of the first psychologists that I ever heard speak. And you were definitely the first that I ever heard speak on cyber issues. And I think it was a day workshop called Growing Up in Siberia. It was held somewhere in southwest Sydney, and you already had a bunch of books out by then. Now, your latest book is called Grandparents, and I read at the start of your book that you wrote it because you couldn't find anything on Australia written especially for grandparents. As soon as I read that, I thought, that's just like you, Michael. You so often see something that's needed before the rest of us. So what number book is this of yours?
It's number 18.
Okay, 18, wow. All right. Thinking back, for the first years of my time in Australia, my children didn't have any family. My eldest two had been very close to their grandparents, and then both sets of grandparents migrated. So we were so thrilled for both my children and my parents to have their grandparents here. Michael, I think we intuitively know that grandparents are important. So I'd love you to unpack some of the research that I've read in your book into the importance of grandparents in our lives.
Well, probably the most important thing is that there are now 5 million people in Australia who identify as grandparents. And the two key reasons why they're more important than ever before is that they're living longer. Their average life expectancy has gone from about 70 in 1960 to about 83 and a half in 2023. And the family sizes are shrinking. So in the 60s, the average Australian family had 5 people in it, now 2.4. So the reason why this is so important is the ratio of grandparents to children under 15 has vaulted from 0.46 in 1960 to about 0.8 today. And the intensity and the complexity of grandparenting has changed. So they have to be across now the technological developments, the educational changes, neurodiversity, sexuality. And I think this makes it much more difficult for them. And while there's no one style of grandparenting, what we know is that the presence of a grandparent in your life is massively beneficial in terms of providing emotional stability, a sense of continuity, it buffers children against the negative impact of adverse childhood experiences, and most importantly, contributes to their resilience.
Wow. Is that because they suddenly have more adults involved in their lives, or why is it that we're seeing this contribution to their resilience?
Well, I think we know that a key component of resilience is having an adult in your life that I've referred to as a charismatic adult, someone from whom you can draw strength, someone who'll make you feel safe and valued and listened to. And while not all grandparents necessarily connect in the same way with their children, we know that having that level of wisdom and emotional support and even cultural knowledge within the family is very, very important.
Yeah. Your book also covers some of the myths about grandparents. What are some of those common myths?
Well, it's interesting because I actually owned some of these myths. I actually thought this before I started researching.
Okay, tell me. Maybe I own some of them too.
Yeah, well, the idea of grandparents as all being old, frail and sedentary, and then I discovered that Mick Jagger was in fact a grandparent and indeed has great-grandchildren. So I had to rethink that.
Great-grandchildren. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, that kind of blows your mind.
It does. So they're not old, they're not frail, and they're not sedentary anymore. The other myth is that they're out of touch with technology, whereas in fact that's not true. They're some of the greatest users of social media. And the other myth is that they're all basically not particularly interested or involved in their grandchildren, and that's not true. There's different types of grandchildren. You've got the traditional, the fun ones, the indulgent ones, the sort of hands-off remote ones, the mentoring ones, and sadly the disenfranchised ones. So there's no one size fits all. And they're not all strict and authoritarian either.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. Just the different types. I just think of my own children's grandparents on my husband's side and my side, and the grandma and nana compared to grandpa and grandpa, we call them. And they actually are so different to each other, but they all bring a different richness to my children's lives. So many grandparents do love to be involved in their grandchildren's lives. And I think, like you highlighted here, it will look different for different grandparents, I suppose, personalities or the way they grandparent. But you write about this 4-step model of bonding and connecting with a grandchild. So if we have a grandparent listening or someone sending this to their parents, what would that look like if you are grandparenting a teen?
Well, the most important thing is to find out their thing, their spark, what gets them up in the morning, what are they interested in? And that can be art, music, dance, drama, sport. but you need to get involved in that particular thing to facilitate a bond. The second step is to document and record the milestone moments. My current partner just had a 17th birthday and a pre-drinks formal at her place, and the grandparents turned up, were most welcome and really documented through video and, phone photographs this milestone moment. And it was just so appreciated by everyone.
So all the grandparents were invited to come and photograph all the kids who
Correct.
were going to the formal. Beautiful.
Which is just such a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And they only stayed for 2 hours because obviously they were hopping on the party bus, as you do.
Yes.
But, they all looked beautiful and kept themselves nice. So the other thing is to mark special occasions, birthdays and Christmas time and holidays, all terribly, terribly important to be there and involved. And most importantly, to pass on wisdom and skills. This, to me, is about passing on the history of the family. Grandparents are the custodians of this family history, and it needs to be passed on. So many people that I meet are telling me how much they regret that they didn't take an oral history from their parents before they died, and all the stories are now gone. And I think this is something that we really need to do. There's such benefit psychologically in ritual and tradition.
I agree. I think of both my grandfathers were in World War II, and my paternal grandfather was most likely suffering from PTSD, and I was only in uni at the time, and there's so much I wish I had asked him. And that's such a reminder to me to encourage my young adult children to talk to their grandparents, but also it's my role, I think, making sure that my parents pass on their history. And I think, Michael, what I find fascinating is teenagers are often a lot more willing or interested or patient in hearing their grandparents' stories than they are of their own parents. I think teenagers will sometimes roll their eyes when you're trying to give advice, but somehow when a grandparent says something, many young people do want to listen, or they just seem to have time for their grandparents. I think particularly if their grandparents have had time for them.
That's very true. I've met a number of grandparents in interviewing for the book who've made a visual family tree and got their children involved in that so that the younger generation can help understand their lineage, and they've even taken them to visit ancestral sites and compiled photo albums and even family cookbooks. I think all of these things are very, very important.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking that where you mentioned right at the beginning, I think the first step is finding your grandchild's spark. And my dad is fantastic with that, with our kids, where he attends every single child's sport, dance, I don't know what, every weekend he's at someone's side of the oval, and often it's been cricket, which is, I know your son's played cricket, Michael, and that is hours of commitment. And that really has meant a great deal to my kids. My children's other grandfather connects in very different ways. So it's amazing how, though, that finding their spark makes such a difference. And I hadn't ever thought of it that way, but I realized that's exactly what my children's grandparents have been doing. So if grandparents are listening, how then do they strike the balance between overstepping and then also being involved in their grandchildren's lives? Because I know some of the parents that I've spoken to have said their parents are sometimes too involved and take over in terms of telling them how to parent. And how do parents strike that balance?
Well, I think grandparents should respect the parents' authority and decisions regarding their children's upbringing. And it's really crucial to communicate openly and respect the parents' parenting style, rules and boundaries, even if you don't agree with them. In 2018, I think it was a sexuality educator was interviewed on the ABC, and she proposed that all parents should ask their babies' consent before changing their nappies.
I remember that.
And I remember there being quite an outcry. And there was a particular part of my social set where the grandparents could not believe that their child was now asking their grandchild, saying, I'm going to change your nappy now, is that okay? Ultimately, the parent was just trying to create a sort of culture of consent. And I don't have a problem with that. I don't think it matters that much. But this really upset the grandparent. But I think as a grandparent, you've got to shut up and you've got to respect the parent's boundaries. Your job is essentially to engage in shared activities, to wait to be asked, to seek feedback on how things went. If you are dealing particularly with teenagers, you need to respect their independence. You need to show that sort of genuine interest and take every opportunity to bond by doing the things that we've talked about, the shared events, the attending the special milestone moments. I think that's the way to go. But what grandparents should never do is undermine parental authority, offer unsolicited advice, criticise parental choices, and don't be violating their boundaries. If they've got views on visitation or childcare or screen time, dietary components, just accept the fact that you're the grandparent, you're not the child's parent. So don't be overbearing, don't judge their choices, and don't, I think, dismiss the values, the beliefs of your children in the parenting of their children.
Yeah. You touched on their dietary requirements and so on. That makes me think of perhaps some of our children with additional needs. So we have teens who might be autistic, might have ADHD. Some grandparents don't believe ADHD is actually a thing just because of how they grew up, and it wasn't a thing when they were growing up. How do grandparents get involved or help or support families with teenagers with additional needs?
Well, what we've discovered is that not every grandchild's brain is wired the same. The job of a grandparent is to celebrate diversity, to recognise that, for example, ASD affects 1 in every 100 Australians, and that means that your grandchild might from time to time struggle to understand social cues, to make eye contact, to engage in reciprocal communication. Your job as a grandparent is to help them to identify their specific triggers, for example, to learn about their specific preferences, to speak normally, and to create a safe, consistent place for them to go when they are stressed. You can have an enormous role as becoming one of the safe people for these children.
Yeah. Of course, you touched on screens and that grandparents are really fantastic, a lot of them with technology themselves, but they didn't grow up with screens when they were little. And of course, they didn't parent with screens in their homes. So when I grew up, my parents weren't nagging me to come off the iPad or off the Xbox. So what advice do you have for grandparents in this area?
Well, I think that if you're charged with looking after your grandchild, if they are physically in your home, I'm a great believer in negotiating with the child's parents what the rules are around screen time, understanding what they are, and then basically replicating them in your own home. So there needs to be a conversation around screens. Look, the reality is that screens have become the undisputed king of the toy kingdom now. And I think a little bit of screen time represents play. I'm very big on play. I think play is a fantastic way to build a relationship with a grandchild. We know that play is hardwired in the brainstem. It's a near universal feature of mammalian life. It's not embarrassing, it's not silly, it's not pointless. It's anything but trivial. So if we can play on screens with our grandchildren and replicate the limits and boundaries that have been set by the parents, I think that's fine.
Okay. And if we have a grandparent listening who's thinking, my children have no boundaries at home with my grandchildren and I'm really worried about them with cyber safety, what then?
Well, I think there are a couple of options that you have. One is you obviously have to have a discussion with the parent as to what your concerns are and provide that parent with resources like, for example, the material on the E-Safety Children's Commissioner's website. Well, they're not children's anymore. It's the E-Safety Commissioner's website. But I also think that we need to encourage play that isn't screen related as a grandparent. Board games, cooking, arts and craft, books, Lego, role play, dress up, visits to the museum or the zoo or trampolines. All of these things don't involve screens. And I think one of the great things about being a grandparent is you can provide the time, the energy to do these alternate activities.
Yeah, I mean, I used to bake a lot when I was young, when I was a girl and when I was younger. And then I don't know what happened. I just don't. And so my daughter has learned all her baking and my youngest son, actually, all their baking from my mum. And so my mum's been fantastic in passing down these family recipes. And you're right, because for my mum, when the kids were there, and when they are there, for her, it's a wonderful activity to be with them. And they just love doing it with grandma, which is fascinating. I'm just thinking now of listeners who have experienced a divorce or separation in the family. What advice do you have then for parents and grandparents in this kind of tricky situation?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, this can happen more often than we like. I think the most important thing is to remain neutral. You can't take sides. Yeah. You've got to prioritise the well-being of the children. And it might be very tempting to take sides. It's not helpful. No. So you don't character assassinate the other parent. You basically remain Switzerland. You allow the children to talk to you about their thoughts and feelings and you validate those thoughts and say, yes, this is tough. But then the most important thing is, as a grandparent, to provide a reframe and to try and focus on the good things. The three things that I want from grandparents in that situation. First of all, to tell their grandchildren, if you can't change something, you can always change the way you think about it and you can help them do that. Secondly, let's see life as it is, but let's focus on the good bits. And thirdly, to remind them that whatever happens with the parents, you're always going to be there. So if you can get those three messages across, I think psychological safety will ensue.
That's beautiful, Michael. And so finally, what is your greatest hope for grandparents and teen relationships today?
Well, I'm hoping that we recognise that the birth of a grandchild results in, this is what I've discovered, a sort of heartfelt, unconditional love that actually is an equal sequel to what they felt for their own children. And it turns out to be one of the best feelings of all. My advice is to start small and grow your involvement as the relationship develops. Don't be a people pleaser who just says yes to everything. Your degree of involvement should actually depend on your ability physically and psychologically and financially to be involved. But I love the whole issue of great grandparenting. It might not stop the war in the Ukraine or address global warming, but I think the number of people I've met who've told me that their relationship with their grandchild is based on love and appreciation and pure joy. I think this is one of the key life transitions. And of course, inside every life transition is an invitation to grow. So accept the invitation.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Michael. And I know that this episode is going to have many listeners sending off to their parents. I really appreciate your wisdom.
Thank you very much, Colette, for having me.
I think the part that stuck with me today on grandparenting was grandparents finding and celebrating their grandchildren's spark. Attending those milestone events and passing on family history. There's something so important about being part of something bigger than yourself. If you found this episode helpful or gained some useful insight from it, please subscribe and review wherever you get your podcasts and consider sharing it with friends and family. I hope to see you next week for our mini episode where we will chat a little more on the topic grandparents. But in the meantime, keep parenting with your teen's future adult in mind.
Hope 1032. Thanks for listening.